Hello and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 33rd installment in our ongoing series. For our May 2025 episode, we are pleased to feature a discussion among 5 of our IGS trustees on the state of higher education in the United States today. The conversation is led by IGS President Lance Strate, who teaches at Fordham University, and includes Vice President Anton of Grand Valley State University, IGS Treasurer Thom Gencarelli of Manhattan University, and trustees Peggy Cassidy of Adelphi University and Susan Drucker of Hofstra University. Their freewheeling roundtable touches on a variety of topics, including the difficulties that students are facing, the challenges brought on by technological advances including AI, issues regarding administrators and financial problems, and the dangers of a hostile political environment. Let's listen in.
Welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Lance Strate, and I'm here with my fellow IGS trustees, Susan Drucker, Peggy Cassidy, Thom Gencarelli, and Anton. And this being the end of this school year, the 2024-2025 school year, and all of us being professors, are all actually tenured professors in communication departments, for that matter, at different universities here in the United States. But it seemed like a fine occasion to talk about the state of higher education, not the least because it's been in the news quite a bit recently, quite a bit more than it typically would be. So I thought I would start by throwing out the question of how are the students doing these days, because we've seen them go through some real changes, not the least having been because of the COVID pandemic, the lockdowns, classes based on Zoom for really a couple of years, and then coming back from that. How are they doing? What's been your experience? Thom, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess I'll point to 3 things that are going on. One is that as far back as about a decade ago, and I was still chair of my department at the time, we found that we were having more and more students who were coming out of secondary school with an individualized educational plan, right, an IEP, that they had various kinds of issues, and they weren't necessarily learning issues. A lot of them were anxiety based and things of that nature. And so more and more students were grappling with these kinds of problems while trying to launch their way into their higher education. The second thing is that I think that there's an extent to which, and I don't, want to seem like the old professor who's been doing this for a really long time and is, jaded, but I think over time I've seen that more and more students are less and less prepared to do what we're asking and inviting them in to do. And the third biggest and most important thing, and just trying to launch the conversation, is the impact of artificial intelligence tools and the large language models and their use and misuse and misunderstanding of them. So to me, it's sort of a triple whammy of things that I've been grappling with, and that I think we've been grappling with.
I think that's great. I mean, I would just go along with all of that. And certainly the mental health issues that seem so prevalent these days are a big concern. But Sue, what are your thoughts then?
I just, in following up on what Thom said, I've had similar experiences and observations. But one of the other elements that I've observed is that the students' ideas about higher education, I think, have changed somewhat over time. And again, I don't want to sound like the old professor who is jaded and is bemoaning the changes in our students and in higher education. I have noticed that the Perhaps it's because of the costs associated with higher ed now, particularly with a private institution like I'm at. There seems to be kind of a different valuation placed on education. I don't know that a liberal arts education is as prized or as valued as it once was. I find that the students are so much more career-oriented, vocation-oriented than they were even a few years ago. And there's, I think, a sense that they are the consumers and of what we as professors offer. And part of the deal that they think that they've made is that they will leave a university with the skills that they need off the bat to secure a good job. And if what you're teaching or what you're trying to convey is not something that is easily transferred into this will get me this type of job, you're facing as a professor an uphill battle to show the relevance and importance of what you're trying to impart.
Yep, Peggy.
Yes to all of that. And something else that I've noticed that I'm sure the rest of us have noticed is the challenge of students being here, there, and everywhere at all times, the distraction of having multiple devices in play during class. So, now the default, at least at my institution, is students assume that they should have their laptops open, for example, during class. And I'm always trying to have them put them away. There's nothing in any of my classes that you need a laptop for, most of the time. I mean, if there's something specific that I want them to do with a computing device, I will tell them, but it only gets in the way, really. And so it's not only the laptops, they've also got their phones, and I can continually try to tell them to put the stuff away so that we can just all be together for a little while, if only for them to have that experience, right? Of only being in one place in all ways for 45 minutes or an hour, just to see what it's like, even if they don't like it, to see what it's like. And maybe we can talk about that. What don't you like about it? Do you notice how distracted you are? It's just, it's complicated.
I mean, I have to say just on that, one of the things that faculty do, especially us senior faculty, is do teaching observations of other faculty. So, you sit in the back of the room and watch, and you can see what the students are actually looking at on their laptops, as opposed to what the teacher in the front of the room can see. And it's not classwork. I've seen a lot of shopping actually going on. But Corey, I know you have some thoughts here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't really disagree with anything anybody said. I think there's just so many other factors related to it. It is partly like it's hard to get a beat on because of everything that's happened with COVID and how we haven't really recovered from COVID. And there was this technological encroachment before COVID, and then COVID just pushed people over the cliff. I think many young people now, and they have employers say as much, that they value and respect multitasking. They're against unitasking. They think that that's not really valued in the workplace. And they think it's like a luxury of the wealthy and the powerful elites to be able to unplug. I think, going back to what Sue had mentioned about the undervaluing of liberal arts education, or, some of what I think we all sort of cherished about our own experiences or whatever, these sort of transformative experiences. I think part of it is that young people are, they're overstimulated, overscheduled to death. That is, they consume 1 million TikToks a day. And so it's almost like like a decade ago or 20 years ago, I could leave class on Thursday and I could pick it up on Tuesday, and almost without a beat, we could continue on where we were talking about it. Whereas now, the amount of information and what's gone on in their lives since Thursday, and then Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, by the time I see them Tuesday, they're like a different person in there. And so there's this sense of, the last thing I'll just say is that I think in some ways they don't value the deep commitment to their own, whether it's professional development or their own character development. There's a sense in which they'll use words like work-life balance, and they have forms of anxiety and depression and other kinds of stuff. But I think they're unwilling to budge on the already allocated 6 to 8 hours a day worth of entertainment. And they're unwilling to give that up. And so it creates all these other forms of, like, they don't want to be seen as like a company person who ends up, giving all their time and all their effort to be an undervalued employee. I think and this is partly also why I think many people are not really choosing to have children, because they're unwilling, again, to give up this what now has become the main part of their life, is just sort of being entertained.
Two things on as follow-up. I've done a poll in my introductory class over the last couple of years, and the figures are astonishing. That every weekend, most of them have iPhones, and they get a notification of how many hours per day they're spending on their phones. And so I take this poll, and it's between 6, but really more leaning to 7 hours a day. And I say, well, so that's interesting because, hopefully you're trying to get 8 hours of sleep a night, whether you do or not. But if 8 hours of a 24-day is sleeping and 6 to 7 hours is on your phone, right? And then there are the things of, maintenance of making sure that you eat and brush your teeth. And so, how much time is left for school and work? And the other piece of it is too, and again, this is longitudinally across my career, when I walk into the room and the group is in there, what are they doing? They used to be in little pods talking to one another about this or that, and now they are silent and they are, scrolling. No one can see me on a podcast doing the finger motion, but they're scrolling on their phones, and that's all that happens till I start class.
That is certainly a change. I would say that along with that, I found that students get up during class and leave class, go out and do this, that for most of my time, students were able to sit in class, and occasionally somebody needs to use the facilities, but for most of them, most of the time, an hour and 15 minutes is not too long to sit in class and not have to get up. And now every class, several people get up. In fact, in one class where I talk about correlation and causality, I give them the hypothesis that since the introduction of smartphones, students' bladders have shrunk. That smartphones have caused students' bladders to shrunk, which perhaps is cause and effect, considering how often they hold them in their laps, but still. It does seem to have really changed and it's strange because they're not even getting up to talk on the phones, which was at least at first what they were, the reason for leaving class to use your phone was because you can't talk on your phone in class. But now it's not that. They're just getting up and doing something out of class. I don't know if you found that to be the case.
But very, very much so. And one of my problems is I try to make a statement about that at the beginning of the semester. I have a statement on my syllabus about that. And not only is not effective, but I've been actually informed by the administration at my university that I am not supposed to be making that kind of request, that students have to be free to get up and leave when they want. And the kind of the negotiated agreement has been that if I word my policy as being that they are not to get up unless there is an emergency, then the university will allow me to make a statement against getting up, leaving, and coming back into class. I think of some of my professors, who some of us have shared, who had a policy that if you get up and leave, don't come back. And whether that would fly in this current environment.
Doubtful.
It does raise an interesting point. I see exactly the same thing, and I'm with you all that someone under ordinary circumstances, all other things being equal, it should be reasonable to expect them to stay in the room, right? Having said that, back to what Thom was saying, the fact that so many more students now are not just that they are anxious, but that they are aware of it, they've been diagnosed, they're in treatment. Sometimes there are mental health reasons why students may need or want to know that they are free to move about. We at my institution have a lot of neurodiverse students, which I know is more common at many or most or all institutions. And again, there it may be sometimes I'm asked or I'm informed by by the offices that serve those students most directly, that like this person may need to get out in the hall and walk around, which is all fine. I mean, I'm certainly not about to say no, we won't do that. But it creates an interesting dynamic because you can't, for good or bad or what, you can't just say nobody's leaving, or if you leave, don't come back. It's not the 80s anymore. Yeah. So things are more nuanced, maybe.
I mean, I guess I just want to really quickly leap in here and maybe just say something on behalf of some of the many fine students that I do have and have had. It's not as if it's not as if the room is on fire and it's a crash and burn. I mean, I think the same communication technologies that have done all of these things to their lives and changed their relationships with their parents and their friends, and they're now still connected to their high school friends when they're in college. And there's all these different dynamics, but they've made a world that is super complicated and complex, and it has so much uncertainty. And so some of it is, it's like a rational animal's move of trying not to spend all its resources on an uncertain future. So some of it does make sense, the kind of presentism that's making them less reluctant to commit to their studies. I mean, I think there is sadly, there's a kind of pessimism, I think, across the board about how inconceivable the future is. If it's wonderful or horrible, in either case, it's just inconceivable. And that makes it hard to commit to, choosing a major, thinking of how well informed am I for the future I'm going to face. I mean, some of it is it's very realistic in its responses, as much as we can be disheartened by what seems to be somewhat like an apathy or a resignation to just going through the motions because nothing's going to really come of any of it anyway. I mean, there's this sort of sense of like inevitablism of the technological change and the uncertainty about in which direction it's going to go and all this kind of stuff.
Go ahead, Thom. Go ahead.
I was going to just latch on to that and say the five of us, all, as Lance, you pointed out in the introduction, teach in communication and media programs, right? And communication media as a academic discipline is kind of unique in that it's got the two pillars, right? That we have this tradition that goes back to the roots of the liberal arts and the trivium, logic, grammar, and rhetoric, right? That's where it all comes from. And so there's a liberal arts tradition to this, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then there's the other side, which is that a lot of our students, when they're majors, come to us for the reasons that this is the stuff that Susan and Corey were talking about, that there's a career path, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow once they get that coupon that is their entry point into their fabulous career. I don't think that our administrations tend to really respect that, we come from both sides of the coin on this, right? That we're trying to do both things. But to go back to the liberal arts part of it, I think our students are more and more divorced from the idea that an education is meant to empower them and that we're trying to help them to empower themselves. And that's not really, about the career path and doing it. We want them to have meaningful work. We want them to have a good life, but we also want them to know and be informed and to know how to inform themselves once they don't have us to, kick them around and push them around anymore.
This reminds me of an advertisement that I keep hearing on television and radio for basically an IT tech program. And the language that's used in that advertisement always gets me because the persuasive strategy is to say, well, what if you have gone into debt for a degree you can't use? And so the assumption is that education for education's sake is not a value. It's education for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And that is a path in education that it is troubling and can really, and I think we're feeling, shake the pillars of academic life and academic institutions that we've grown up with.
I think some of it is so difficult, Sue. I mean, I completely agree. I'm, with Thom as well. I mean, I'm completely committed to the liberal arts tradition, the transformative experiences. I personally was very transformed, but I think I would be lying to myself if I would say that I'm able to appreciate those independent of the fact that I did end up getting a good job. See, I mean, there's a sense in which all of us are here gainfully employed, and we can still say these are really important, life skills, and it's very important to be, broadly educated and to be able to pursue the life of the mind. But that's easier said when you're also gainfully employed. If you don't have gainful employment, you go, yeah, it's really wonderful that I've, boned up on all my Epictetus. It really helps me get comfortable with my poverty. It's tough it's a tough sell.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the questions I'm trying to get at here is sort of like, are the kids all right? And the sense that maybe they're not. And, to throw out a couple of things here, and I think there was always a tension between students and parents, where the parents are the ones who place a certain amount of pressure on getting a job and pursuing a course of study that will lead to employment that's practical, whereas the young person is more open and maybe wants to pursue something that has no readily apparent practical application. And part of the change when we're talking about the technology is that parents are so much more involved constantly in the students' lives, that when I went away to college, as an undergraduate, I would talk to my mother once, calling from the payphone on Sunday morning when the rates were low. Whereas our students now, their parents are texting them and in touch with them many times during the day, and that really is a very different kind of dynamic. And the other thing I wanted to throw out, and this is very recent, and it speaks to the AI thing. And actually, someone mentioned to me the other day that talking to the graduating seniors, that they're terrified, and this is something completely new, that they are absolutely terrified of the job market that is out there. And there was just something in the news, a executive at LinkedIn who said that AI is basically eradicating entry-level jobs, that exactly the kind of tasks that are entry level, which usually involve things like these sort of like rote kind of things like typing things up or, that sort of stuff. I know, and I can remember when I was first hit, when I was graduated school, it was all how words per minute typing. Every entry level job was about how fast you can type. But that all of that is being turned over to AI, and then how are you going to get started in any kind of organization, any corporation, if you can't start at that entry level kind of mailroom or what we used to call secretarial, sort of administrative kind of work, and move up from there.
It's a problem. I mean, but there's a lot of different definitions of the singularity. I think most people go to Ray Kurzweil with this merger of the artificial and the biological. But Ben Goertzel, the Hanson Robotics guy who did Sophia the robot, right? He says the singularity is when game-changing, groundbreaking technologies start to be released like every other day or every day. And by those lights, I think we are beginning in the singularity. It started probably about maybe a year ago, and like we're in it now. And so I think that it's not going to stop, Lance. It's just going to get worse and worse. I mean, there's going to be real problems of, how's the economy going to thrive? And so it's not just a problem with young people and or education. It's the entire society is on we're on a train rail, and there's no way to stop it. I mean, if people know anything about, Google's project, it just had its release of Google Alpha Evolve, and it's now it's a self-educating AI, which many people said you do not want to go down this path, and we're down that path now. So I don't think it's going to just get worse and worse. As agentative AI becomes, able to do tasks, you're going to have more mid-level jobs, and the only thing that's going to stop the job loss is certifications, licenses, and sort of bureaucratic foot dragging that's built into some of the businesses and the institutions.
I think the larger issue is how technology of all sorts, and certainly AI, is changing the relationship between students and their professors. So the job of a professor, or the role that a professor, I think historically took, the idea was that we had information, we had knowledge and insights that we could impart. Now I feel more like a tour guide where I give them URLs, and that the value is not so much in what I have to impart as much as where I can point them to find the information. So I think the relationship between faculty and students is changing, and certainly AI is feeding into that, because who among us has not read a paper in the last 2 years where we said, what part was AI written? How
All
much
of it.
can we devise new assignments that are AI proof? So I think that the very nature of the relationship between faculty and students, the trust that we have, and the assumption that we make about each other's roles and responsibilities, and ethics, have been altered by technology in general and by AI in particular.
Yeah, Peggy.
I'm just thinking also that something that's been incredibly frustrating for me and probably all the rest of you over certainly this past couple of months, but really it's been going longer than that, is the horrifying inability of higher ed leaders to articulate why what we do matters. In other words, I'm thinking the transition here is more when I think about students and why they go to college, why we as a society think college that there's any point to going, relates to the fact that it's so obscenely expensive. And so it's very hard to make a case for, bettering yourself, making yourself a better citizen, having a better world because we're educated, when it's going to cost so much more than you can possibly afford to spend on it. And so it's part of this bigger systemic problem, right? Of why can't we work it out so that people can afford to do this. And having said all of that, in the past year or two, I can't tell you how many times I've been yelling at my TV set as these prominent university presidents testify before Congress and can't or won't do it, won't say why it matters. They're just dropping the ball, I think, on all of us, and that's certainly not helping.
Can I just say for the folks who are listening who are not in academia that incredible cost of higher education does not go to our salaries. It does not go to the faculty at all. Just want to make that clear. It is not, we are not the ones who are causing this to happen. And just Peggy, to your point, and maybe part of that inability to articulate what it's all about comes from the fact that for some time now, the higher administration tends to not come from faculty or faculty who spend very little time being faculty. So they really are divorced. They become specialists in fundraising. And so they're very good at doing that, but they don't really understand the educational mission that we're all about. Corey and Tom, I see you guys want to pipe in here. Corey,
Yeah.
or
I mean,
Tom?
if we can encapsulate the history quickly for the sake of this podcast. Um, After World War II in the US, we built an industry, right? To go back, Sue, to what, well, and Peggy, what you were saying, that it was partly with the creation of the GI Bill and these guys who actually made it home from war in one piece, right? Giving them opportunity. But what we really built an industry that at one point I remember looking up the figures, and we had 5,100 degree granting institutions in the United States. And what we're seeing now, and one of the reasons we're having this conversation today, is that things are starting to contract for all kinds of reasons and in all kinds of ways. But what happened in that period after the war, and we started really building up the land grant, institutions into these, cities, right? And employing all of these people and making higher ed egalitarian, right? Welcoming everybody. Well, what happened? Well, the 1960s happened, and protests on campus about the Vietnam War, and for civil rights and for first wave feminism, women's liberation, right? And suddenly all of the people who thought that this was a great idea to have an educated workforce, right? Folks in power who said, well, wait, we don't want people questioning the system. We just want educated workers. And that's when federal and state dollars started being pulled out from the support of higher education, right, by the 70s. And that's why tuition went up and became what it is.
Well, it's interesting because, I remember as a kid, here in New York City, Queens College, because I grew up in Queens, that tuition was free and it was a $65 student fee. That was the cost for going to Queens College. And, that was really, an incredible opportunity, and it contributes so much to democracy. But I mean, there are other factors, of course, and since we're talking about this now, we could sort of shift over to that, that we've been seeing this kind of meltdown where a lot of the smaller schools, quite a few that we know of, have folded. Others have, Tom is particularly knowledgeable about this, have faced major financial difficulties. And part of it is the change in demographics too. Part of it is actually bad administrators whose focus was on, say, kind of boondoggles where they put, thinking about New Jersey City University building, was it like $1 million new building that almost bankrupted the school and forced them to lay off tons of faculty just because they did it just before the demographics shifted. And when you're tuition driven, you're in trouble. So what can we say about that? I mean, apart from knowing that the question of when is an administrator lying, and the answer being when they move their lips. But Sue, I think you have something to say on this.
Part of the picture is also the perception of the public, I think, about the kind of money that some universities have in an endowment. And a good deal of the discussion lately, particularly with the threat to federal funding, has been, well, a lot of these schools have a lot of money, and why do they need public funds when they have rich endowments? And I think that there's a misunderstanding about the funds that universities have, what they can be used for. So many portions of the endowment are earmarked, that the bequests come with strings attached, that it's not just a question of we've got deep pockets at the university and we're just not using it, but we're looking for public funds in addition to the largesse of funds that we already have. So I think that there's that part of the problem is certainly, as Lance said, administration, poor decisions, questionable allocation of funds. But the other part of it, I think, has to do with public perception, which is, I think, erroneous, that that there's all this money that a lot of universities have, or certainly private universities have, and why are they looking for big tuitions? Why are they looking for donations by alumni? And most importantly, why are they looking for public funding? There's a reason why public funds and bequests and donations are important, but I don't think the public understands the full kind of financial picture of higher education these days.
It's a good point. We could also, though, I'm going to just counter that by saying we could also talk about administrator salaries and, and think about Peggy's school, Adelphi, and of course, Thom at Manhattan University. Used to be Manhattan College, now it's Manhattan University, and they're institutions where the higher administration salaries become incredibly out of whack. I think, Corey, I imagine at a state school like yours, they are set by the state government.
I'm not sure exactly how that gets negotiated and structured. I do think there's an administrative bloat everywhere, and that's where a lot of the funds go. And there's a proliferation of assistant deans and associate deans of all kinds of different special programmings and this kind of stuff. I mean, I think the thing that I would maybe want to go back to is I think part of the tension about, what is the value of higher ed? It's in some way sort of like a gym membership where there's a lot of people, they could buy gym equipment and have it in their basement and try to do that, but they want to be around other people working out. And there's this whole like ethos and energy level that comes from being in a classroom with people. And it's also, there's a socializing that goes on in live time interaction, in the classroom where you're learning to tolerate ambiguity, understand others' views. There's all this kind of self-growth and self-understanding that's going on. But there's also, I think a lot of schools have become sort of like ways for kids to meet other kids in the same economic status. Like their parents want to like create those kinds of connections. And increasingly, universities are places of incredible facility, like day spas. There's all this funds that go into the comforts and the pizzazz of the school. And I think that is really at odds with the, let's get up to the library and just study. And I think people want to go, if what you want is a humanities degree, philosophy, English, history, anything like that, get a library card and get some smart friends and, go online and figure it out. Whereas if you have something that needs a lab, I think there it seems more justified to taxpayers. They go, well, you're going to cure a disease, or even, I think we have the good fortune of having an advertising, public relations, and broadcasting journalism within our School of Comm. And so I think there is still like practical value there and sort of business applied value that people recognize. So I think that really helps comm programs stay afloat in the way that some of these more humanities programs are. They're very likely on a chopping block sooner. I think STEM is fairly safe. I think, again, you're going to do, art history. Oh, God, you're probably on the way out. But I think if you can show value to the public by, everything from journalism or to like ad and PR, well, I think those are going to be a little bit harder to lop off, would be my guess. But there is a contraction. It's just a numbers game. There's not as many people having kids. There's not as many people turning 18. And there's all these other changes happening about, reinvigoration of the trades, people wondering about the question of the value of ed. At Grand Valley, where I'm at right now, we've just done very well because our school is aligned with this Blue Dot initiative, which is a high tech. We're trying to become the high tech part of Michigan, and some of the other schools have really been hit in their enrollments. We've fared okay, so I'm grateful that we haven't been nearly as badly hit as some other programs.
But maybe some of what's coming up then, and you kind of bring that up, Corey, is the cultural divide that exists. And that has been emerging as one of perhaps the biggest divide in American culture is between those who have college degrees and those who do not. And I think that was really evidenced when Biden was president with the student loan forgiveness, where, on the one hand, that was welcomed mightily by many people, and on the other hand, engendered tremendous resentment by many, many others.
I think is a very difficult thing to argue. I mean, especially because the information explosion, it fosters the idea that no longer, it's just what Sue said, I mean, no longer is this need for the professor to impart the knowledge. It's almost like if our role has changed, it's become less of I'm the source that you go to get the knowledge. It's more like there's an information overload and I have a filtering function where I try to guide them toward what could be relevant and useful or potent and try to keep them away from the triviality and the irrelevance that's, coming from other directions.
Well, I wonder if that isn't almost like undercutting ourselves, and there's this whole thing of like, don't be the sage on the stage, be the guide on the side. And by going along with that rather than, actually, kind of acknowledging our own expertise, we kind of are really undercutting ourselves in ways.
Well, no, I think that metaphor, we've heard that expression, but I mean, I think increasingly the guide by the side, that's 10 years ago pedagogy. The pedagogy that's swinging back now is the sage on the stage. You have to be able to go, have you heard of this author? Have you heard of this tradition? Do you realize that there's this school of thought? And you have to be able to clarify that live time in an interactive way. The young people are much more oral. They're much more interactive. I think one of the number one complaints that I hear from students, and they never say it about my classes, they bitch about other classes, is they're PowerPointed to death. They go in there and some professor just stands there and reads text-based slides for the bulk of the period. And then they wonder why the students are bored and playing on their laptops. Well, shit, you got to be engaging. You can't just sit there and pretend that giving them the information is what teaching is.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about PowerPoint, and although I do use it in like depending on the class, but I think that from the faculty side of things, I mean, that's one technology, one medium that has really damaged what we do.
Also, talk about the layers of redundancy here. What if the PowerPoint is also? What if the prof is also teaching from the textbook or the book, and so teaching from the book that the students are supposed to have read, and all of the stuff that's in the book is on the PowerPoint, and they're talking about what's on the PowerPoint.
They're not reading the book. You can no longer assume that when you assign a reading that it will be done. You have students at the end of the semester say something about, oh, was there a book? Well, I've been referring to it all semester and it's on the syllabus. And sometimes I even hold it up and, oh, was there a book for the class? They're not buying the book. They're not reading the book. And so there's an assumption there are assumptions that you used to be able to make that perhaps you can make in a graduate class that you can't make in an undergraduate class any longer.
And you can't assume that they think it's worth listening to you in class if what you're going to talk about are the PowerPoint slides where you summarize what's in the reading, because then why should they do the reading or listen to you? What for our little clever stories that we like to tell that we think are so funny and we've been telling them for 30 years, with minimal modification.
They still make me laugh.
Well, I think that's all right, Peggy. I mean, I would add to that, and this is, I think we need increasingly to have multimodal forms of assessment. So, you assign a reading, then there's a little 5-question quiz they have to take before class over the reading. It's worth 1 point. And then you have to have, in class where they're reading aloud. You have to have some exams where they're just closed book, some exams where they're open book, some papers they have to write in class, other papers they get the luxury of using AI, and you say, run the AI with the best you got. We're expecting everyone to use AI, and we're going to judge the paper according to this has to be a publishable essay now that you're using AI. And you just multimodal all the way around. And I mean, I think that's the only way to really grab it by the horns. You can't just run and flee and go in one direction or the other. I don't think you can just go back to the Husky pencil, but we can't just go, let's wait robots for everyone. I mean, it has to be across the board. I think most parents are kind of like, how do I make sure that my child has enough technology that they don't get left behind, but how do I keep them from having so much technology that they just junked out on the stuff? So that sweet spot of balance is really key.
And flexibility, yes.
With respect to reading too, little backstage for the listener, we're actually carrying out this conversation on a Zoom, and I put in the chat before about reading that the idea that students would actually read a syllabus, right? You post it up there for them and tell them this is your course contract. And if you have any questions about what's going on in the requirements for this class, it's in the syllabus. So don't send me an email in the middle of the night and ask me, right? Read the syllabus. And of course, a problem with syllabi has become that administrations, in the name of retention and the name of course learning objectives, they require us to add all of this extra stuff onto what would be the syllabus that we would write, which makes it even longer. And so the students open the document and they see the the little scroll on the side of the screen become really tiny and go all the way to the top, and they're like, no, I am not going to read this, absolutely not. So that's where the course starts, though. I will post my syllabus 2 weeks before the course is going to begin and say, take a look at this. If you have any questions on the first day, we're going to talk about it a bit, but and they're already gone.
I think, another factor is, is on this, in this same kind of realm is grade inflation and the expectations that students have about grading. And I know that's a topic that came up this semester. I think, through the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and I know that faculty at my school were talking about it. I mean, in the past, it was always something that the administration, like a dean, would bring up, to the faculty, but here it was faculty themselves bringing it up as a topic of discussion.
I mean, I think the thing that makes me think of is just Thom's observation about the ability to post the syllabus 2 weeks before the class started. See, I think it's like we're not acknowledging the kind of rapid pace and the temporal compression that we've all put ourselves into over, say, the last 30 years. It's like, I remember when class would begin. On that first day, you would show up and the professor would hand out the syllabus, and that's the first time you got to see it. And we'd go, okay, we're going to pick this up next time. And like things they would unfold. And sometimes a syllabus would have, we're going to begin here and we'll give updates on where we're going to go to, depending on how far we can get. Now everybody's got it all planned out in advance, and they've got the whole syllabus and the entire course all designed in a front-loaded way into Blackboard. They're demanding it to keep at this sort of this technological inhuman pace, and we've lost this kind of Gemeinschaften of like us relating and interacting in very personal ways with one another. Instead, it's become very scheduled, bureaucratic, routinized,
For folks who are not familiar with this, Blackboard is one of several different learning management environments that schools use nowadays. Which are basically, I mean, they're not that different from social media platforms, except they're designed for courses so that you have to, I mean, you include on Blackboard your syllabus, and if you really, I mean, if you're forced to or want to uh, use the technology, you have to have all of the readings on there, and uh, students are, you know, again, if you're using it, I tend to like not use it myself, but if you do use it, then students upload their papers onto Blackboard and faculty correct it onto there. So everything is formatted in a way and constrained and pushed by this technology rather than being more flexible, as Corey's pointing out, more free flowing in the classroom.
Part of this is also about the autonomy that a professor has. So
Yeah.
when they change the platform, when they go from Blackboard to Canvas, for example, as another educational platform, um, there are some of these platforms that determine how you are supposed to design your syllabus. And if your syllabus doesn't match up with the template that's provided, you can't upload your syllabus. And so there's a degree um, of professional um, freedom, of academic freedom, that is slowly being whittled away by the technology.
I don't want to change the course of the conversation, but I know that before we started, we were talking about some of the things that we wanted to try to address, and I do want to bring something up before our time is up, and before the listener tunes out. Um, so, Lance, you mentioned before that I formerly worked at Manhattan College, which at the beginning of the 24-25 academic year became Manhattan University. And there's an interesting and important story behind that. It's not that we suddenly grew or added, you know, doctoral programs or a law school or a medical school. We became a university along with a number of other colleges in New York State because the New York State Education Department decided in the face of the problem of decreasing enrollments. And we could, you know, we started to talk about what's the cause of those decreasing enrollments. We didn't really go too far, but in the face of that, what the education department in New York State said is if if the colleges become universities, we'll be more attractive to international students, right? The Europeans, for instance, right? They have a 3-year bachelor's program and 4 years to a master's, and they have the university model where you take the test to get into university. Otherwise, you go to an arts school or, you know, something of that nature. So a university is more prestigious, right? We didn't become more
Hmm.
prestigious. We changed our signs. That's all we did, right? But what happened right away after this decision was made and Manhattan became Manhattan University, Iona College became Iona University, Malloy College out of Long Island. Right after this, suddenly the current administration has made it so that international students are not really feeling welcome. And I have, for instance, a Norwegian student who is taking a gap year because her parents were worried about and uncomfortable with her being, you know, here in the States and studying in an institution in the United States. And again, this is, you know, someone from a European country, right? A Western European country. Um, Talk about bad timing overall, right? But this is a part of the picture I think that we wanted to address.
Yeah. So we'll take that turn then. Thanks, Tom, because you know, I think for folks at public universities like Corey, I mean, the rest of us are teach at private schools, but I know that at public schools, there always has, for a long time, been pressure from state governments because they're funded through and really controlled ultimately through the states that they're a part of through the individual state. But now with this current administration, we've seen a certain amount of hostility towards universities, and that part of that has to do with this whole crackdown on immigration and that sort of thing. And I can say that for our faculty at Fordham University, for our faculty and students who are not U.S. citizens, and they have all been advised not to leave the country because you might not get back in. And we've seen, cases where students have been arrested and put up for deportation. We've been seeing this sort of thing happen. I mean, as well as the attack on universities for based on political grounds that has been going on. So, interested in all of your thoughts on what we're seeing today.
One of the things at my university has been teaching faculty members how to deal with ICE and what the procedures are on campus if somebody from ICE enters your classroom, or if one of your students informs you that that they think that they have been targeted by ICE. We've had a situation where the local police department has been deputized by ICE. And so now there's a fear if you see the local police on campus, a chill goes up your spine because you don't know if they're there for local police investigation or whether they're there to haul one of your students off. So far, there haven't, at my university at Hofstra, there haven't been any reports of students being snatched up, but there have been reports within the School of Comm building that we've been visited by the local police on behalf of ICE. And that sends a real chilling effect throughout the university, certainly students and faculty, even with the kind of encouraging support that we've been getting from upper administration and the Board of Trustees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say Sue and I work at institutions that are really just a few miles apart. So we're in a similar situation. It's the same county, it's the same police force that's been deputized by ICE. And we've gotten similar advice from the various relevant offices at Adelphi University about what to do if ICE agents show up at the door of your classroom. And I do feel like my institution has been trying to keep us informed, but it's very unsettling. And having seen some photos of, not at other institutions of higher education, but in neighborhoods where ICE raids have happened, if these big giant guys with all of their gear show up at the door, it's going to be very hard without a lot more practice, training, something to remember what you're supposed to do. We're supposed to call public safety. Who's going to be able to think straight under those circumstances? So yeah, we're all, I think, glad that this semester is done and there's a little time to kind of think and organize and know what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, we haven't been hit as hard, I guess, here. I'm not sure. Our graduate program has a lot of international students, and I think that will take, it's taking a little bit of a hit there. But our undergrad, we don't have that big of an international contingent there.
Well, it definitely has hit graduate programs. I've spoken to folks at other schools too, and just applications, international applications are way down. And it's obvious because of because of this government now and its hostility to folks from the outside and to our universities. We're also seeing reports of brain drain. We always benefited from the brain drain here in the United States, but now it's folks going to other places, leaving our campuses.
Yeah, research money is being drained, grant money is being drained, and there would go the brain drain, but also the basis for graduate programs, right? Most of them.
Yeah. And it's another good point is grant money. I know at Fordham we've had some major grants just pulled, without warning, and not like you won't get it in the future or something. It's like grant money that was promised and expected is just immediately cut off. Which is just, I mean, it's just an ugly way to proceed, even if there was any kind of rationale for doing this apart from just pure hostility towards higher education.
I was
Aside
standing.
about what's going on, what the government is doing. Um, Part of what they're also doing, aside from the actual implications of pulling funds, of threatening institutions with their not only the funding but with the tax exempt status. Um, we've seen some colleges like Columbia um, appease um, where Harvard stands up. Um, but part of what's going on, aside from the actual logistics of what this administration is doing, they're also, I think, changing or the public perception of what higher education is about. Um, I always think that higher education is sometimes about making people feel uncomfortable, about exposing people to ideas um, and authors, philosophies, methodologies that are sometimes uncomfortable. But this is where you have a sanctuary, a safe environment to explore and to confront and be confronted by what makes us feel uncomfortable. And now we're living in a world of trigger warnings. At one point at my university, there were actually big signs up as you moved from the residential side of campus and entered the education, classroom environment side of campus, big trigger warning signs that you may be exposed to ideas that upset you. Um, I think that's what the institution is about. And with the demands that were made on Harvard and other institutions, and equating it with the money that public funding supplies for research, um, and and scholarship money and Pell grants, etc. Um, that I think is altering public perception of what we do, and that kind of confrontation of uncomfortable ideas is not acceptable. But that's what I thought we were about. And I'm worried that the public is being led in a very different path, down a very different path in their perception of of what is higher education.
It is a worry too because, if you only have private funding, I mean, corporations have very specific things that they're interested in and, specific goals, and that's fine. And that funding is important, but it then falls to the public institution, the government, to provide funding that is not specific to short-term profits, in the way that corporations are. And you don't know. That's part of the problem is that when you have this utilitarian, kind of view, you don't know what research is going to result in what kinds of findings, that what is, where it's going to go. And, to try to determine that ahead of time, is basically to say, we're not going to explore things anymore. And there's not going to be this sort of serendipity or even some kind of like seemingly ridiculous study may have some small part of it that it becomes a launching pad for something very significant. Um, and that's not going to happen when you just, pull funding completely, and which will before too long result in us really lagging behind the rest of the world. I know this was a concern back in the 80s. You remember, and we were talking about how in Japan the government provides all this funding for research that let them, for a while become economically dominant. And of course, China being communist, the government provides a tremendous amount of funding for education, but not in this free way that we have here, but here we have this idea of just doing the complete reverse of that and cutting it off, just starving our institutions.
Well, I think it's also troublesome because in some way I guess the promise was to get the federal government out of what amounts to states business. But then you can see the federal government does want to have some sort of say in what's going on at the state level. And even now, I guess, university curriculum and this kind of stuff. Yeah, it really does seem to be a problem. I mean, this is, and it's very profound in that it's not just the fact that corporations have an interest in certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of knowledge production for their interests, but it's that now you're having whole states in their history and civics lessons being taught gross misinformation as fact. Do you know what I mean? So, I mean, there are ways in which it's not even just wholly corporate. It's anti integrity about what historical inquiry is.
I mean, the bottom line is I'm very fearful of not only the financial environment for higher education, but the free speech environment and the free thought environment of higher education.
And that's the free marketplace of ideas. Part of it is just to let the ideas be exchanged and see which ones prove to be the most accurate or the most effective. But it's also to be able to defend yourself, to be able to make the argument and reason, apply reason and rational discourse in order to make those determinations. And so much of this really brings us finally to what general semantics is about, because it's like, are we teaching people to make good maps, accurate maps of the territory? Are we teaching them how to, properly evaluate information and evaluate what's coming to us from the outside? Are we teaching them how to use language effectively and honestly, transparently, and to understand how others are engaged in language appropriately or are just engaged in bullshit? That was one of Neil Postman's great things. It's just a profound enemy of bullshit, and that's what we're supposed to be about. But that's exactly what's under attack.
I mean, just real quickly on that, Lance. I mean, I think this is where, I would say general semantics has a lot to say, but maybe needs to go to the drawing board and to figure out what exactly that would be said. Because if we're going to talk about maps and territories, it seems like that was part of the problem that this whole discussion began with, which is it's one thing to ask a question of how well is a space being abstractly represented. It's another thing to ask how well can we abstractly represent a future which seems very, very uncertain. Like, I'm not sure how accurately anyone could map like where the culture is going to be, say 15 or 20 years from now. Like, it's literally emergent. And I'm not sure that we, like, if anything, we have to have tolerance for the continuous updating of the maps, which then becomes almost exhausting. It's like, what's the point of having a map if you have to update it every 10 minutes?
Well, but from a general semantics point of view, it's absolutely essential that we understand that the territory is changing, and so we have to keep updating our maps or at least understand that the maps may no longer be accurate.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. But to that extent, then the map becomes the mapping of uncertainty, and uncertainty is what you end up representing. And that, I think, is a fact. That I think
Yeah.
that some of the languor that we're seeing in the culture, in people's motivation toward the future, in long-term thinking, there's all these different ways in which you can see it. Is just there is a real inability to have a good, clear sense of how things are going to be just 10 years from now. And I think part of it is we're in the aftershock of the social media rampage. I mean, social media kind of came out of nowhere 15 years ago, and it just shook up and revised so many of the way our businesses are done, the way that people interact, all friendships, all this kind of stuff. And I think people are starting to smell that AI is going to do the same thing 10 times over.
Yeah. I'll just say the counterpart of the map is the blueprint.
Mm.
And, we're sort of like driving blindly where we could be planning and thinking about where are we heading and where do we want to go. And again, I think that's something that general semantics really has a role to play because it forces us to think in those terms. And, going back to good old Alfred Korzybski, is thinking about the future. Time binding isn't just about the past, it's about the future, and seeing that continuity. And, as we've talked about, I mean, so much of our technology currently, focuses completely on the present moment and is ahistorical, in its biases, and in the same way is not at all forward looking. And yet, we talked about, general semantics being based on the idea of progress, that we can make progress, and it's not just technological progress, it's progress in the human condition. And that's where I think that's part of the role for higher ed too, is to see that as a mission.
It's a mission, but I again, not to be dogged about it, but I mean, I think Korzybski was he was disappointed over the fact that engineering had made such progress, but the human character, the human element had not.
Well, and that brings us back to why we need the liberal arts.
Yeah, right.
Which in Korzybski's day, I mean, an engineer would also have an excellent background education in the liberal arts as well.
I read something from Renee Hobbs. It wasn't her, and I forget who she was citing, but she said, we're great at inventing things and inventing technologies. We're just not really good at knowing how to use them. I know that so much of the territory that humans are creating right now is, especially, in this country, in this system of democratic capitalism, we are selling it, right? And one of the things that I think that I've always tried to do as an educator is to say to students, I'm not trying to sell you anything. Again, other than the idea that, this is your life, and education is to help you learn how to use it and learn what to do with it. And you've got to face, what is being sold to you and why it's being sold to you, and try to make your map out of that. And, again, with respect to the instability and uncertainty of the future, and where things are going, in the way that we sort of talk about technology in this blanket way, right? I think it's really important to try to step back from the fact that there are guys in, ill-fitting suits trying to sell you a bill of goods.
I would just kind of finish up by warning um, that if we lose what higher education is all about, we won't get it back. So we can't easily relinquish what our vision of higher education is, and think that at some time in the future we'll be able to reclaim it, which is what I think appeasement to current policies portends. If we lose it, we lose it. So it's worth fighting for the vision that I think has been articulated throughout our discussion, and certainly highlighted by Lance's comments linking this to general semantics. We have a vision that's worth fighting for.
I think that's a great point, and if we lose it, we lose the future. Sue, Corey, Tom, Peggy, thank you so much. This has been fabulous discussion. Of course, we haven't solved any of the problems, but I think that in keeping with what we're about as higher educators, we've hopefully helped whoever's listening to understand what's going on a little better and think about it and come to their own conclusions. So thank you all.
You've been listening to our May 2025 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Corey Anton, Peggy Cassidy, Susan Drucker, Thom Gencarelli, and Lance Strate. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics, if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 33rd episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time, and until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.